an exhausted German shepherd and her pups found in a snowstorm. Will the man risk everything to save them or turn away from their desperate plight? Stay with us until the end of this heartwarming story. It's one that will touch your soul and bring tears to your eyes. The snowstorm howled outside, fierce and unrelenting. Biden sat in his small cabin, his world reduced to the crackling of the fire and the glow of its light flickering across the walls. Retired now, the quiet was his constant companion. Snow piled high against the windows, sealing him off from the world. Days of isolation weighed on him, though he told himself he didn't mind. It was the kind of night where no one should be out. But then came the sound, a faint scratching at the door, barely audible over the storm. Biden froze, his coffee mug mid-air, listening. There it was again, a muffled whimper, desperate and weak. He set the mug down and stood, his heart picking up pace. At the door he hesitated, his hand hovering over the knob. Through the frosted glass a shadow shifted. Clearing the window with his palm, he saw her. A German shepherd, trembling, her breath misting in the cold. Pressed close to her sides were two tiny pups, barely visible in the snow. Her coat was heavy with frost, her ribs pressing through her thin frame. Biden's chest tightened. He whispered, "What the hell happened to you?" The dog stared back, her eyes meeting his, pleading but cautious. She didn't bark, didn't move. She just stood there, shielding her young, a picture of frozen resilience. Biden understood the risk. Letting them in meant taking on more than he was prepared for, but leaving them out there wasn't an option he could live with. Finally, he opened the door. The wind surged in, icy and sharp, but the dog didn't flinch. "Come on, girl," Biden said, crouching slightly to meet her gaze. "You'll freeze to death out there." The dog whimpered, glancing at her pups. Slowly, she nudged one forward with her nose. The pup stumbled, its tiny legs sinking into the snow. Biden's heart ached at the sight. Without hesitation, the mother picked it up by the scruff, stepping cautiously inside. The second pup followed, struggling to keep up. Biden closed the door, shutting out the storm's roar. Inside, the warmth hit them all at once. The dog trembled violently, her body adjusting to the sudden change in temperature. The pups, too, shivered as they pressed close to her. "Wait here," Biden muttered, moving to grab an old blanket from the couch. Returning, he draped it gently over the small family. She recoiled slightly at first, but when she realized he posed no threat, her tense body released a trembling sigh. Slowly, she settled near the warmth of the fire, wrapping herself protectively around her puppies. Biden crouched beside her, his mind racing as he observed the fragile little beings. Their tiny eyes were barely open, and their breaths came in shallow, uneven rises and falls. When he reached out to touch one, a low, warning growl stopped him in his tracks. It wasn't hostile, just cautious, a mother's instinct to shield her young. "All right," Biden muttered, pulling his hands back in a gesture of peace. "I get it. You're just doing your job. You've been through the ringer, haven't you? Let's get you warmed up," Biden said, his voice softer than he expected. Standing up, he made his way to the kitchen and filled a bowl with warm water. Returning, he placed it a few feet away from her and stepped back, giving her the space she needed. Her wary gaze followed him, but after a moment's hesitation, she leaned forward to lap at the water. The pups huddled close to her side, their tiny forms trembling slightly, but finding comfort in her presence. The dog eyed him warily before taking a tentative sip. The pups, tiny and fragile, huddled together under the blanket. Biden knelt down, watching them, unsure of what to do next. He hadn't planned on this. His life was simple now, quiet, predictable. But as he looked at the three of them, something stirred deep inside, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself in years. "You're safe now," he said, almost to himself. The mother dog, sensing the warmth of the fire and the safety of the room, finally relaxed. She lowered herself onto the floor, curling protectively around her pups. Biden leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his thoughts swirling. Where had she come from? What cruel turn of events had left her out in the middle of a blizzard with 2 newborns? Her gaunt frame and frost-bitten coat told a story of struggle and survival. She'd been on her own for a while, long enough to weaken, yet her will to protect her pups had carried her this far. It was nothing short of miraculous. But now what? Biden wasn't prepared for this. He'd always been fond of dogs, but his retirement had ushered in a quieter, simpler life. It had been years since he'd cared for a pet, and now here he was, staring down the responsibility of not 1, but 3 lives in need. The weight of it pressed on him, yet as he watched her exhausted body curled protectively around her pups, he knew he couldn't turn them away. "You've got a spirit, I'll give you that," Biden said softly. "Looks like I'm not the only fighter here." As the hours stretched into night, Biden busied himself with making them as comfortable as he could. He laid out towels for the pups to rest on, placed a small bowl of food near the mother, and stoked the fire to keep the cabin warm. The German shepherd tracked his every move with sharp, observant eyes. Her body tensed for any sign of danger, but gradually her posture softened. For the first time she lowered her head onto the blanket, her eyes growing heavy. The pups squirmed beside her, their tiny breaths audible in the quiet room. Biden watched from his chair, the fire casting a soft glow over the scene. He couldn't shake the unexpected sense of purpose swelling within him. It was as though the storm outside had blown these 3 souls into his life to remind him of something he'd forgotten: connection, responsibility, hope. He didn't know what the next day would hold, but for now he had done what he could. As the storm raged on beyond the cabin walls, Biden made an unspoken vow to the mother and her pups. They were safe now, and he would make sure they stayed that way. When morning came, it was the sound of soft whimpers and the faint crackling of the dying fire that woke Biden. Blinking against the early light streaming through the frosted window, he glanced toward the hearth. The mother was awake, her ears twitching at every faint noise, but her body remained curled protectively around her puppies. The storm had finally passed, leaving a pristine layer of snow sparkling in the soft glow of the morning sun. Biden rubbed his eyes, and his thoughts quickly turned to the unexpected visitors who had sought shelter in his cabin. Glancing toward the fireplace, he saw the German shepherd still curled protectively around her pups, who were squirming gently beneath her warmth. Hearing Biden stir, the mother's ears twitched and her amber eyes opened, fixing on him. Her gaze still held a hint of wariness, but the raw desperation from the night before had softened. "Morning, girl," Biden murmured as he stretched and moved toward the kitchen. "Let's see if we can get you something to eat." He rummaged through the pantry, pulling out a can of chicken soup. It wasn't ideal, but it was all he had. Biden heated the soup on the stove, poured it into a shallow bowl, and set it near her. The dog lifted her head and sniffed cautiously before beginning to eat. Her pups, sensing her movements, let out faint cries and nestled closer to her. Biden crouched a few feet away, watching quietly. "You're tough, you know that," he said softly. "Getting those little ones through that storm. You deserve better than this." As the morning wore on, Biden took stock of their condition. The mother's ribs were painfully visible under her thin coat, and her exhaustion was evident. The pups were small and frail, but their wagging tails and persistent nursing showed a spark of life. Biden felt a pang in his chest. He had witnessed plenty of hardship in his years as a firefighter, but there was something uniquely poignant about their silent struggle for survival. Determined to do more, Biden picked up the phone and called the nearest veterinary clinic. When the receptionist answered, he introduced himself. "Hi, this is Biden Carter. I've got a German Shepherd and her 2 pups here. They're in rough shape. Do you think you could take a look at them today?" The receptionist's voice was warm, yet efficient. "Of course, Mr. Carter. We can fit them in this afternoon. Bring them in, and we'll see what we can do." Biden exhaled, relieved. He glanced back at the German Shepherd, who was now licking her pups gently, her maternal instincts shining despite her frailty. "Hear that, girl?" he said softly. "We're going to get you some help." Getting them to the clinic proved tricky. Biden found an old blanket and tried to coax the mother onto it. She hesitated, her body tense, and let out a low growl when he moved too close to her pups. "It's okay," Biden said calmly, his voice steady. "I'm not going to hurt them, I promise." After several minutes of patient reassurance, the mother finally allowed him to lift her and the pups into the back of his truck. Biden carefully secured the blanket, making sure they were as comfortable as possible, and began the slow drive into town. The icy roads forced him to drive cautiously, but his mind raced with questions. Where had she come from? Was someone out there searching for her? Or had she been abandoned, left to survive in the bitter cold? At the clinic, the staff moved quickly, their practiced hands examining the mother and pups. Dr. Monroe, the veterinarian, ran her hands along the dog's emaciated frame, her brow furrowed. "She's severely underweight," she said, "but she's a fighter. Her pups are lucky she made it this far." She looked up at Biden with a thoughtful expression. "She's been through a lot. Recovery will take time, but with the right care, she'll pull through." Biden shook his head when Dr. Monroe asked if he knew where the dog had come from. "She just showed up at my door last night," he said simply. "There's no way I could have left her out there." The veterinarian gave a gentle smile. "Well, she definitely came to the right place." By the time Biden got them back home, the mother dog seemed more at ease. The pups, content and lively after their feeding at the clinic, snuggled close to her side. Biden stayed nearby, observing as the German Shepherd finally began to let her guard down. She even allowed him to inch closer, her wary eyes softening when his hand gently brushed over her head. "You're safe now," Biden whispered, his voice thick with unspoken emotion. "I don't know what you've been through, but as long as you need it, you've got a home here." For the first time, the German Shepherd leaned into his touch. Her body, once tense with fear, began to loosen. Biden felt his throat tighten with an unexpected wave of emotion. Letting her in had been an impulsive act, one he hadn't thought through, but now, as her trust in him slowly grew, he realized they'd both found something they hadn't known they were missing, a renewed sense of belonging and a shot at a fresh start. The following days settled into a gentle rhythm of healing and trust. Biden had taken to calling her Nora, a name that seemed fitting for her quiet strength. Slowly, her fragile frame filled out, her coat gained a healthy sheen, and the light returned to her eyes. The pups, whom Biden affectionately named Snow and Ash, grew more spirited with each passing day, their tiny bodies brimming with energy. Biden often spent hours sitting cross-legged by the fireplace, giving Nora space to grow accustomed to his presence. At first, she watched him warily, her body coiled in a protective stance. Gradually, though, her posture softened. Her low growls faded into occasional sighs, and soon she began to accept his proximity. One evening, as the wind roared outside, Biden leaned back against the couch, watching the fire flicker and glow. Nora lay close by, her head resting on her paws, while Snow and Ash tumbled clumsily over each other, their tiny tails wagging furiously. Biden chuckled softly at their playful antics. "They're tough little ones, aren't they, Nora?" he murmured. His gaze shifted to her, and their eyes met. There was something in her expression, an unspoken gratitude that reached him in a way words never could. Slowly, he extended his hand, letting it graze her head. This time, to his surprise, she didn't pull back. Instead, she leaned into his palm, her body finally at peace. As weeks passed, Nora's recovery became undeniable. The scrawny, matted dog that had trembled on his doorstep was now vibrant and full of life. Her coat gleamed, her ribs no longer visible, and her energy returned in joyful bursts. She played with Snow and Ash, gently nudging them forward when they stumbled and watching over their clumsy explorations of the cabin. Their tiny barks of excitement filled the once quiet space, transforming it in ways Biden hadn't anticipated. Biden, too, began to change. For years, he'd lived a solitary life in the cabin, content with the stillness of his retirement. Now the silence was replaced by the soft thud of playful paws and the warmth of shared companionship. Evenings once spent in solitude were now brimming with life. Nora and her pups had brought something intangible into his world, a renewed sense of purpose and connection he hadn't realized he needed. Looking at them one night, as Nora lay peacefully near the fire and the pups drifted off to sleep beside her, Biden smiled. Life had shifted in ways he hadn't expected, and for the first time in years, he felt like he truly belonged to something greater than himself. One afternoon, while Biden worked outside, he noticed Nora by the window, her nose pressed against the glass. Snow and Ash, her tiny pups, tumbled and played near her feet, their playful energy filling the air. Biden paused, wiping the sweat from his brow, and gave a friendly wave toward the window. To his surprise, Nora wagged her tail, a small, hesitant motion, but enough to make Biden's chest tighten with unexpected joy. When Biden returned indoors, Nora met him at the door, her tail wagging slightly as she nudged his hand with her nose. It was the first time she had willingly approached him, and he couldn't help but grin. "Well, look at you," he said with a chuckle, crouching down to scratch behind her ears. Nora leaned into his touch, her tail swishing more enthusiastically now. Snow and Ash barked in excitement, playfully circling Biden's legs. As the days passed and their connection grew, Biden found himself wondering about Nora's story. What had led her to his cabin on that stormy night? The question lingered in his mind. The scars along her coat, the cautious way she moved when startled, all told a tale of hardship and survival. Whatever her past held, one thing was clear. Nora had faced the unimaginable and had fought to protect her pups. She was a survivor, through and through. That night, as the fire crackled and cast warm light across the room, Biden sat on the couch with Nora by his side. Stroking her fur gently, he said, "I don't know what you've been through, but I'm glad you found me. You and these little ones, you're family now." Nora lifted her head and met his eyes. In her gaze was a quiet understanding, a bond that transcended words. She let out a soft sigh, then rested her head on his lap, her body fully relaxing for the first time since she'd arrived. Biden felt a lump rise in his throat as he watched her, his hand moving rhythmically over her fur. He hadn't anticipated how much Nora and her pups would change his life. But as he sat there, surrounded by their presence and the warmth of the fire, Biden realized they'd filled a void he hadn't even known was there. They'd given him companionship, a sense of purpose, and something he thought he'd lost forever: hope. Morning sunlight filtered through the cabin's windows, casting soft golden rays across the floor. Snow and Ash tumbled over each other, their playful yips breaking the stillness of the cabin. Nora lay nearby, her eyes half closed as she rested, though her ears flicked at every small sound. Biden stood by the kitchen counter, coffee mug in hand, a rare sense of peace settling over him. But beneath the calm exterior, questions gnawed at Biden's thoughts. Nora bore the marks of a difficult life, her thin frame, the faint scars across her coat, the way she flinched at sudden movements. Someone, somewhere, had failed her. Biden couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that whoever was responsible might still be out there. That afternoon, Biden decided it was time for Nora and her pups to experience the outdoors. The heavy snow had begun to thaw, revealing patches of frozen ground and bare earth. Nora hesitated as she stepped onto the porch, her nose testing the cold air as though searching for signs of danger. Snow and Ash, still clumsy on their tiny legs, followed close behind, their excitement bubbling over as they explored the unfamiliar terrain. Biden watched them with a soft smile. "You're safe now, girl," he said gently. "Nothing's gonna hurt you here." But as they wandered a bit farther from the cabin, Nora suddenly froze. Her ears pricked forward, her body tense and alert. Biden frowned, stepping closer, his voice low and steady. "What is it, girl?" Nora's eyes darted toward the edge of the clearing. Her body grew rigid, her nose pointed sharply toward the edge of the forest. Biden followed her line of sight, his muscles tensing in response. "What's out there?" he murmured, stepping closer to her. Nora let out a low, guttural growl, the fur along her back bristling. Biden narrowed his eyes, straining to see through the thick trees, but there was nothing visible. Yet, the way Nora positioned herself, defensive, alert, was enough to confirm his suspicions. Something was lurking in the shadows. Acting swiftly, Biden scooped up the pups, holding them securely in his arms as he guided Nora back to the cabin. Once inside, he bolted the door and drew the curtains tightly shut, his heartbeat thundering in his chest. Nora didn't settle, though. She continued pacing by the window, her sharp eyes darting back toward the woods. Later that evening, as Biden sat by the fire, the unease refused to leave him. Nora was stretched out nearby, her pups snuggled close against her side, but she remained vigilant. Every creak of the cabin made her ears twitch and her gaze flicker toward the door. Biden reached over, his hand gently scratching behind her ears. "You're not imagining things, are you?" he asked softly. "You've been through something like this before." His mind wandered as the flames danced in the fireplace. What could she have endured to make her so guarded? Had someone abandoned her? The thought tightened his chest. Biden clenched his fists, anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. How could anyone treat her this way? Whoever was responsible had no right to call themselves human. The next morning, Biden resolved to get answers. He loaded Nora and her pups into his truck and headed to town. The local animal shelter was modest but well organized, staffed by a small group of dedicated volunteers. At the front desk, he approached a woman named Sarah, whose kind demeanor softened the weight he carried. Pulling out a photo he had taken of Nora and the pups, Biden explained, "I found her near my cabin. She looked like she'd been out there a while. I was wondering if anyone's reported her missing, or if you recognize her." Sarah studied the picture closely, then sighed and shook her head. "I don't recognize her," she said, her voice tinged with regret. "But we see dogs like her far too often. There are breeders around here who keep dogs in horrible conditions. When they're no longer useful, they just dump them." The words hit Biden like a blow. "You're telling me she was just abandoned?" he asked, anger flaring in his voice. Sarah nodded solemnly. "Unfortunately, yes, but she's lucky she found you." The ride back to the cabin was heavy with silence. Biden's thoughts swirled, replaying Sarah's explanation. Nora had been discarded, treated as if her life held no value. But she wasn't worthless. Not to her pups, and certainly not to him. Determined, he made a promise to himself. Nora would never feel unwanted again. When they arrived home, Nora stepped out of the truck cautiously, her nose twitching as she sniffed the air. Her tail wagged faintly, a flicker of cautious hope. Snow and Ash, the pups Biden had named in a moment of inspiration, tumbled out after her, their tiny legs moving with determination to keep up. Biden watched them, a blend of anger and hope swelling in his chest. "You're safe now," he said firmly, looking directly at Nora. "No one's ever going to hurt you again." Nora turned to him, her amber eyes softening in a way that felt almost human. Biden swore she understood every word he said. In that silent moment, he made a vow. Whoever had caused her pain would never have another chance. The days that followed brought a cautious calm. Nora began to relax little by little, her trust in Biden growing stronger with every passing hour. Snow and Ash filled the cabin with their boundless curiosity, their tiny barks and playful antics echoing through the once quiet space. Despite the warmth and security inside the cabin, Biden couldn't shake the sensation that someone or something was keeping watch. Late one night, that unsettling feeling turned into a grim reality. Biden sat near the window, absently stroking Nora as the fire cast flickering light across the room. Outside, the moonlit snow stretched into the yard, long shadows creeping from the trees. That's when he noticed it. A figure at the edge of the woods. Biden's breath caught as he leaned closer to the glass, straining to make out the shape. It was tall, human-like, cloaked in the dark. It didn't move or make a sound. It just stood there, observing. "Nora," Biden murmured, his voice barely audible. At the sound, the German shepherd's ears perked, and she followed his gaze. The moment she locked eyes on the figure, a guttural growl rose from her throat. Her body stiffened, and she moved instinctively to shield the pups from whatever threat lingered outside. Biden pulled the curtains shut in a rush and grabbed his phone. Dialing the sheriff's office, he tried to steady his voice. "This is Biden Carter," he said. "There's someone standing near the woods outside my cabin. I don't know who it is, but they've been there a while." The dispatcher assured him a deputy was on the way, but the unease gnawed at him. Biden's grip tightened on the phone. This didn't feel random. It was deliberate, targeted. As the minutes dragged on, every second felt like an eternity. Nora remained by the door, her growls low and constant, while Biden paced the room, his eyes darting toward the curtained window. At last, the glare of headlights cut through the darkness, and Biden exhaled a shaky breath as the deputy's car pulled up. Deputy Miller stepped out, her no-nonsense demeanor immediately apparent. She was tall, with a sharp gaze that missed nothing. Biden met her at the door, quickly explaining what he had seen. "This wasn't just someone passing by," he said, his voice firm. "They were watching us." Miller nodded, her hand resting lightly on the flashlight at her hip. "I'll take a look. Stay inside and make sure everything's locked." Biden nodded, the knot in his stomach tightening as he watched her disappear into the woods, her flashlight beam cutting through the trees. He returned to the window, fists clenched, waiting for her to return. Nora sat beside him, tense and alert, her eyes fixed on the same spot in the darkness. When Miller came back, her expression was serious. "There's no one there now," she said, but her tone carried weight. "I found tracks leading right up to the edge of your property. Whoever it was, they were watching." Biden's throat tightened. Did you find anything else?" Miller hesitated before answering. "There was a rope tied to one of the trees. Looked old, but it's been used recently. My guess is someone's been camping out here in the woods." The words sent a chill down Biden's spine. "Do you think they'll come back?" "I can't say for sure," Miller replied, her voice steady. "But we'll have patrols circling the area more often. If you notice anything unusual, call us immediately." After the deputy left, the cabin felt heavier than ever. Biden made sure every window and door was locked, his thoughts racing. Who had been out there? And what did they want with him? Or the cabin? Settling into his armchair, Biden rubbed a hand over his face. Nora approached quietly, pressing her head against his knee, her eyes watching him with an understanding far beyond words. He reached down, his hand brushing over her fur. "Don't worry, girl," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll keep you and the pups safe. No one's going to hurt you." For now, the cabin was quiet again. But Biden couldn't ignore the feeling that someone was still out there, waiting. Nora let out a faint whine, her amber eyes locking onto Biden's. For the first time since she had arrived, he noticed a new emotion in her gaze, a mixture of fear and recognition. She knew something about the man in the woods, and whatever it was, it shook her to the core. That night, Biden found sleep impossible. He stayed near the window, his rifle within arm's reach, ready for whatever might come. Nora lay curled at his feet, her ears twitching at every sound. Snow and Ash, blissfully unaware of the tension, snuggled close to the fire, safe in their little world. As the hours crept by, Biden made a silent promise. No matter who or what came after them, he would protect Nora and her pups. They were his family now, and he wouldn't let anyone take that away. When the first light of dawn filtered through the cabin's curtains, Biden had barely closed his eyes. His thoughts kept circling back to the shadowy figure in the woods. Nora had stayed by his side all night, her body taut with vigilance. Meanwhile, Snow and Ash slept soundly, oblivious to the unease that hung in the air. Biden reached for the coffee pot, hoping caffeine might steady his nerves, when suddenly Nora sprang to her feet. She bolted toward the front door, her ears pricked and a low growl vibrating in her chest. Biden froze, his hand hovering over the coffee pot. Grabbing his rifle from the corner, he moved cautiously to the window and pulled the curtain back just enough to peer outside. His stomach churned. The figure was back. This time it was closer, lingering just beyond the edge of the porch. "Damn it," Biden muttered under his breath, gripping the rifle tighter. He turned to Nora, speaking firmly. "Stay here." But he knew she wouldn't listen. Cracking the door open, Biden stepped onto the frost-covered porch, the wood creaking under his boots. His voice was steady, even as his heart raced. "Who's out there? This is private property." The figure didn't respond at first, but eventually stepped forward, revealing a man in his 40s. His hooded jacket was worn and tattered, and in his hand he held a rope. A smirk twisted his face. "That's my dog," the man said, his tone calm but edged with menace. "I've been looking for her." Biden felt his blood run cold. "Your dog?" he echoed, disbelief coloring his voice. "She showed up half dead here, dragging 2 pups with her. If she's yours, why the hell was she in that state?" The man shrugged nonchalantly, stepping closer. "She got loose. It happens. But I'm here to take her back." Biden raised his rifle slightly, its barrel now trained on the man's chest. His voice dropped, firm and resolute. "You're not taking her anywhere. She's not yours anymore." The man's smirk faltered as he stopped in his tracks. His eyes narrowed. "You don't know what you're dealing with, old man. That dog's trouble. She's better off with me. Biden's grip tightened on the rifle. No, she's better off with someone who actually gives a damn. Now get off my property. At that moment, Nora appeared in the doorway. Her body was rigid, her lips curled back to reveal sharp teeth. A deep growl rumbled from her throat as she stood firm, a guardian unwilling to back down. The man's confidence wavered, his smirk fading entirely. Biden took a step forward, his voice like steel. I won't say it again. Leave. She let out a deep, primal growl that sliced through the icy morning air. The smirk on the man's face vanished in an instant, replaced by a fleeting glimpse of fear. Nora, step back, Biden commanded, his voice steady, but she stayed rooted to the spot, her gaze locked on the man. It was then Biden understood this wasn't a random stranger to her. This was someone she remembered, someone from her past, the one she had fled, the one who had harmed her and her pups. The man stepped back, the rope slipping from his grasp. You've made a big mistake, old man, he spat, his voice betraying a slight tremor. You don't know what that dog's capable of. Biden advanced a step, his rifle still aimed. The only mistake here is you thinking you could come back and take her, he replied coldly. She's not leaving and neither are her pups. Now, get off my property before you regret it. For a moment, the man hesitated, his eyes darting nervously between Biden and Nora. But then, without another word, he turned and disappeared into the woods. Biden didn't lower the rifle until the figure was completely out of sight. Slowly, the tension in his shoulders began to ease. Back inside, Biden bolted the door and crouched beside Nora, who was still standing alert, her body tense. He's gone, he murmured, his hand gently stroking her head. You did good, girl. You kept us safe. Nora let out a shaky breath, her muscles relaxing as she leaned into Biden's hand. Nearby, Snow and Ash stirred near the fire, their tiny yips breaking the silence. Biden carefully lifted the pups and set them beside Nora, watching as she curled protectively around them. That evening, as the fire crackled softly in the hearth, Biden sat on the floor beside Nora and her pups. He knew there was a chance the man might return, but he also knew Nora wouldn't run this time. She had found her home, her family, and a strength she didn't realize she had. And Biden. He had discovered something he hadn't known he was missing, a reason to fight, to protect, and to care. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of life reigniting within him. Together, Biden and Nora had faced a darkness neither of them had expected. Together, they would confront whatever came next. Nora's journey, from that snow-covered doorstep to the warmth of a home, was nothing short of extraordinary. Her resilience, her loyalty to her pups, and the bond she built with Biden spoke volumes about the transformative power of trust and love. The years had crept by, leaving their quiet marks on Biden. His once strong hands had grown weathered, his steps slower, but his heart remained tethered to the family Nora had given him. The pups, no longer small and helpless, had grown into sturdy, loyal companions. They stayed by Biden's side through every season, their presence a steadfast comfort. Yet, time had also come for Nora. On a bitter winter afternoon, the cabin was unusually still. Nora lay on the old rug by the fireplace, her breaths shallow and labored. Her once vibrant coat was now speckled with gray, her body frail, but her spirit unyielding. The other dogs surrounded her, quiet and watchful, their eyes reflecting an unspoken understanding. Biden knelt beside her, his hand resting gently on her head. "You've always been the strongest of us," he murmured, his voice heavy with emotion. "You carried us through storms, kept us whole. I don't know how to say goodbye to you, girl." Nora's eyes, dim but warm, met his, a flicker of peace in their depths. She let out a soft whimper, nuzzling her nose against Biden's hand one last time. Her body relaxed as her breathing slowed, and then, with one final sigh, she was gone. For a long moment, Biden sat motionless, his hand still resting on her. The fire crackled softly, the sound mingling with the faint whistle of the wind outside. The other dogs leaned against him, their silent presence grounding him in his grief. As the afternoon faded into twilight, Biden rose with effort, wrapping Nora in the same old blanket he had used to warm her so many years ago. He gathered his tools and stepped outside into the biting cold. The snow crunched under his boots as he made his way to the edge of the property, the dogs trailing close behind, their breaths visible in the frigid air. The ground was hard, frozen by the relentless winter, but Biden worked steadily, his hands trembling with a mix of exertion and sorrow. The other dogs sat in a circle around him, their eyes never leaving their mother's resting place. When the grave was finally ready, Biden knelt, gently placing Nora inside. He paused, his hands lingering on the blanket as if reluctant to let go. He whispered, his voice cracking, "You were my family." The dogs moved closer, pressing their bodies against him as if to share his grief. Snow began to fall, the flakes settling softly over the earth. Biden took a deep breath, gathering the strength to finish. He covered the grave with soil, his motions slow and deliberate, until the mound was complete. Standing there, surrounded by the loyal companions Nora had left behind, Biden felt the weight of the years and of love. The dogs leaned into him, their presence a silent vow to carry on the bond Nora had forged. As darkness fell, Biden and the dogs returned to the cabin, the firelight flickering through the windows. Though the ache of loss filled the air, so too did the quiet assurance that Nora's legacy would live on, etched in the hearts of those she had touched. Together, they had faced storms, found solace, and built a family that could endure even the coldest winters. It's a story that reminds us of the unwavering love and loyalty that animals bring into our lives, and the profound connections we can share, even across species. If this story moved you as much as it did me, take a moment to reflect on the relationships in your life, human or animal, and how they shape who you are. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more heartfelt stories that celebrate the beauty of connection and the power of hope. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story. Until then, stay safe, stay kind, and treasure the moments that truly matter.